Woman who makes a mistake. A good dinner party broke a few rules. It came off better if things were running a little late and not overly neat. Her mother said she thrived on chaos, but that wasn't true. She tolerated it. She managed it. She planned the guest list, the menu, and a toast, and the rest she left to the occasion. She would rest an arm on someone's shoulder, lift a glass, and say, "To the intimacy of the table," which was both flattery and an instruction. Her guests were a rotating cast of romantic failures. Couples were welcome as long as they didn't behave as if on leashes. The usual suspects included her neighbor Adam, a single dad with whom she shared one wall. He brought whatever was missing, because as they were two halves of two broken families, they often brought each other what the other was missing: a taller ladder, milk for cereal, peppercorns, the shoulder. He taught her the meaning of her favorite word, propinquity. Nearness was the virtue of their relationship. The wall was barely a barrier between the houses, and she liked it that way. She liked the permeability of her home. She thought of the house as more boat than house because a boat made more sense for her life. A boat contained her need to be at home with her need to be away. If her life had been too permeable in ways, she considered that a risk worth taking. Like the cigarette she smoked on the stairs to the roof when the kids were asleep, they put wind in her sails. Besides, all the Russian mothers smoked. She wasn't Russian, but she preferred their company on the playground. They didn't hover. They didn't believe in pushing their children on the swings. But when it came to cake, they pulled out all the stops. The Russians say you can't forbid living beautifully. She had briefly fallen in love with things falling apart. If neglect in her marriage had been a kind of competition, the affair put a finer point on it. Her lover was a master of decomposition. He made gifts of decaying objects. He made her sandwiches with prosciutto he carved off a leg that hung from his ceiling. When the car stopped working, they let plants grow under the hood and up through the steering wheel. They ate off the floor. They fucked on dirty sheets. He ate what was left of her, and she let him, and then he ate her marriage and half of everything, and the dog. But we create our own families, she insisted, even when things fall apart. She salvaged the dining room table. She foraged for friendships and harvested them delicately. Some people waited to see her settled again, and she said, "But I am. This is settled." She propped the kids up in bunk beds and kept sailing. "Life isn't the sum of what happens to you," she told them. But she hadn't settled on the second independent clause. Something, something, ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. Stefan would be in charge of pouring. The men in her life were unlikely heroes with superpowers that suited a woman who enjoyed the view from the tracks. She fell for them in direct proportion to what they could not offer her. And when things no longer worked, she swapped out their heads and weapons. Stefan was a pirate who loved to provide opening questions. "What do you think of Beowulf?" As a middle name. She poured oil in the pan and swirled it to cover the bottom. The tulips were on the table, the glasses selected. She roughly chopped the onions on the butcher's block and tossed them into the hot oil to saute. The trick to not crying was not holding them too long. Traditional holidays tarnished, she loved to create occasion from ordinary events. This night was the occasion of her friend Margaret's second date with Rob from OkCupid, where her profile was attracting a B-list of ex-drug addicts with pet birds. "You really can't make this stuff up," Margaret texted with the image. An unofficial dinner club of Margaret's would-be boyfriends sprang up. On any first Thursday, she brought her latest Birdman to dinner for inspection. On these nights, there was a code word which, when spoken on purpose or accidentally, would be the signal for everyone else at the table to take a drink. The word was bird, or any sort of bird, and one test of a Birdman was whether he could take the joke. If the test was a little cruel, she made up for it with cake. Since the divorce, everything had become dark comedy. The baby was getting tired. He complained as he cruised around her in the kitchen. She slid the chicken into the oven and set the timer, 350 degrees at 20 minutes per pound. There were errands to run. The baby clung to her with wobbling knees, begging to be held. She lifted him up and held him close, and he laughed and smacked her in the face with a train. He would nap in the car. The car seat banged heavily into her thigh and a familiar bruise. She placed the chair in its cradle. He wailed, "Shh, shh. It's okay. "It's okay, baby," she said, and stroked his cheek. So far, parenting this one had been a marathon of soothing that drained the out of her. She had named him Felix after a hurricane and happiness. She shut the door, slid behind the wheel. She had learned to drive through the screaming. She focused her eyes above the wheel and turned on the radio, and drove through a pile of pink eucalyptus leaves on the shoulder as she rounded the park and ran through her list. The red dress at the dry cleaners, 6 ceramic flan cups at the kitchen store in Clement, ice. On the radio, an interview with the mushroom hunter about his book on the sexual life of fungi. His voice was soft as wet leaves, and after a few minutes, the screaming was replaced by defeated whimpering and then silence. At last. The mushroom hunter was seducing her with his mushroom stories. The Armillaria solipedis has a root system of shoestring, mycelial cords that can travel under bark and between trees for hundreds of miles and 1,000 years. She reached through time to something intact and perfect, a time she barely remembered when she felt irreversibly connected. Sometimes she felt like she had let go of the cords, and other times that the world gave her nothing to grip. In any case, she pushed the memory down. The car was the only place she allowed these moments because by some sort of poetic theory of relativity, it provided at least the illusion of a continuous present without consequences. The car was driving uneventfully through space, and she perceived no changes. The feelings came up, and she was at the wheel, and there were no witnesses. At the dry cleaners, she collected the red dress and proceeded down the rest of the long blocks of shops. It was one of those neighborhoods in the city that assumed that life was just one long dinner party, that there was nothing else you would need to stay alive in San Francisco. A butcher, a wine shop, a fancy kitchen store for extra place settings, and equipment for manufacturing miniature waffles, and a stationer's for the thank you note. She passed the bookshop, and a title in the window caught her eye. "Happy Women Live Better." She was suspicious of anything marketed at eye level on California Street, especially happiness. In line at the kitchen store, she thought of the next thing on the list. The next thing on the list. There was something else. She remembered thinking, there's never enough ice. She had left the oven on. The baby was napping. She couldn't see the baby napping. She didn't remember putting him down in his crib or leaving him in the house with the sitter or saying goodbye. There was a gap in the tape. Why couldn't she see him? What day is it? A Thursday. The baby was with her. But then where was he? She knew it all at once. Regrets, too many to mention, converged in a point with the force of collapsing stars. The baby was in the car. Her heart began to suck in everything in its path. Her knees gave her one moment of weakness standing at the counter by the cashier with the 6 ceramic flan cups. And she started running. My God, how long had she been gone? How long had he been in the car? She flew past the flowers and buckets on the sidewalk outside the gourmet market, the brunch line at the pancake restaurant, the kitchen store with the Danish gadgets. She put the heat of the day into some calculus with the length she imagined she had been gone. 20 minutes? Had it been longer? A group on a bench watched as she fell into the side of the car and pressed her hands against the glass. She stared in at her baby. He was still, his head slumped forward, sweat beading the little channel between his nose and mouth. Was he breathing? She couldn't tell. She paused a second longer, as if to know first would make it easier to accept what she found and touched when she opened the door. Then she opened it. The baby sighed and rolled his head towards her, his eyes still closed, still asleep. Someone had let her be lucky. Someone had forgiven her. She lifted her sleeping baby into her arms and kissed him on his mouth. She kissed him awake. She felt the cords that grew beneath her and stretched 100 miles in 1,000 years. She closed her eyes and let relief swarm inside her like a murmuration of starlings. That night at dinner, there was a longer toast. With the baby on her knee, she tugged at the frayed string of the tablecloth as she confessed the story of the day, and her friends gave her absolution. She was grateful. The ordinary Thursday became Thanksgiving. Everyone got to drink at the word starlings. She asked the bird man to please carve the chicken, and she toasted to the intimacy of the table.